So there's a lot of different ways to classify horror. You can classify it in terms of, is it supernatural or not supernatural, or kind of maybe a bit mixed? Is it like science fiction horror? Is it fantasy horror, etc.? Is it body horror? Is it like a slasher? I mean, you want like there's all kinds of genres and subgenres and classifications you can come up with. When I'm thinking about horror, I kind of put it in categories, and these are not hard and fast, and these aren't even really the terms I'd necessarily use. But when I do these videos, I'm not trying to say use this system or even that I use this system. It's to try to give a bit of a framing device to talk about the the broader kind of concepts. So when I go into these, I'm going to talk about a couple how I would define the different types of horror. You don't have to define it that this way, and I don't even necessarily myself. But this is just trying to get at the underlying idea. So to me, what kind of differentiates different types of horror is a, how much is the horror a reflection of internal things, internal demons being addiction, abuse, uh, corruption, sin, cynicism, bad relationships with others, etc., versus how much is the horror external? Is it a serial killer? Is it an asteroid about to destroy the planet? Is it a ghost? Is it something that man has no control over? That's just kind of there. And to my mind, you have this internal projection versus external, and everything in the movie kind of follows along with that. And then you also have the aspect of what is the morality of the movie, because horror is still a very puritanical genre in a lot of ways. It's a lot more right wing in a lot of ways than other things are, because the idea of sin is taken very seriously. The idea of, do people deserve things? Do people not deserve things? Are these things actually crimes? Also, just a lot of religious issues tend to be dealt with, because when you're dealing with things like the nature of the soul, with like ghosts, with demons, etc., you also have to deal with the opposite. You have to deal with God. You have to deal with the church. You have to deal with heaven if you're going to deal with hell. So it tends to touch on these themes, and also just kind of by virtue of what you're covering, moral questions become very important. And so in a lot of movies, even after we live in an age where sex has become very, premarital sex has become very like non-controversial, in horror movies you'll often see that leading to characters' deaths, or people being degenerates like alcoholism, drug abuse, etc., being kind of factors that lead to the person's ultimate demise. So we kind of have the sliding scale here. So this is both a moral scale as well as an internal versus external. So the first type of horror we have is redemptive. So this is where the main character normally survives, or if they die, it's a death equals redemption, or a redemption equals death type of scenario. So this is kind of the most like the traditional hero's journey. It's probably the least like what you'd normally consider to be horror. But this is where the main character, they start off cynical, they start off flawed, etc. They aren't necessarily a terrible person, but they've been hurt somewhere in the past. Or there's an aspect of themselves they just haven't managed to get in touch with. It's very similar to kind of the traditional hero's journey, etc. And they go through the horror is kind of used as a projection of what's inside them, be it their relationship with a family member. And we'll get into some specific examples for this. And feel free, if you want, to post in the comments section of this video examples you think kind of typify these. Also, if you agree or disagree and you think I'm right or wrong or whatever, feel free to post. I'm always interested in how people view these videos. But yeah, so you have stuff like that. Maybe like some examples of redemptive things that aren't horror. The Indiana Jones movies are always, I think, a good example of these for me. Like, Indiana Jones always starts off as being very cynical, but it is kind of, to a large extent, it's about a man discovering his faith in God and in humanity. George Lucas obviously really likes this. Star Wars is very much about that. Vader kind of descends into hell, and there's horror movie aspects about Vader. Like if you watch Revenge of the Sith, there's literally like that scene where he's burning at the river of fire, and then Palpatine shows up looking like Satan, and he's lost everything, he's become a monster, etc., but ultimately he's redeemed by love. So obviously Star Wars isn't a horror movie, but Vader's character has a lot of traits of a horror movie monster, and Revenge of the Sith has a lot of horror movie aspects to it, particularly the scenes involving Palpatine. So the second we have is retributive horror. Retributive horror? Sorry if I'm pronouncing that wrong. But this is where, even if it's extremely disproportionate, there is an aspect of the horrific things that are happening are in payment of something. So there's kind of, I guess you could say, two subgenres within this. There's what I'd call original sin. Now, horror is very connected with Christianity for a lot of reasons. But if we just go back to the story of the Garden of Eden, all of the evil that's happened in the world, murder, death, disease, everything came from man's primordial disobedience to God. And kind of everything is a punishment for that going on, and like the wages of sin are death. You can also just say it's karmatic, that like in dharmatic religions, that when you do bad things, eventually the bad things will come back to haunt you, if not in this life then in a previous life. That's also true in Christianity, but it's this whole idea that you did something and you're getting punished for it. Lovecraftian horror is often kind of a mixture of these two, because it is cosmic. In fact, it was kind of the trope codifier, but it's also normally like the whole man was not meant to meddle, searching for forbidden knowledge. I've created a monster, something kind of like Frankenstein. A lot of kind of science fiction horror tends to be in this category. People looking into things that they shouldn't be looking into, hubris, pride, etc. There's some aspect of the character's actions, even if it's wildly disproportionate, that leads to the events. Then we have cosmic horror, which I would kind of consider to be, well, I'm sure you know what cosmic horror is. A natural horror might be another way of putting it, in which there is no moral message really at all. There's just a very bleak way of looking at the world. Or not necessarily, we'll see. Some of the examples I have are actually not nihilistic movies. But the horror itself is not a result of anything the characters in the movie do. They may actually be very good people, as we'll see in a couple of my examples, but it's something external. It's a monster. It's aliens. It's an indifferent god. It's a serial killer. It's something that has nothing to do with the main character, and it scares by virtue of pointing to the powerlessness of an individual human, of just saying there's all these horrible things in the universe, and regardless of the way we act and behave, they're going to come down on us. So let's get into this. Okay, so redemptive horror. So you may notice already I have two exorcist movies, or two movies about exorcism. It's a massive subgenre in horror, and they're pretty much all within this category. So very briefly, let's just kind of cover those. So The Exorcist is obviously one of all-time classic horror movies, and at its core, I think it's not really about the girl; it's about the young priest, and it's about him. He's cynical, he's lost kind of his faith in God, but by working with the old priest and trying to treat the girl, he begins to find meaning in his life again, and ultimately he sacrifices himself to save her, resulting in his death, but he's also redeemed. He's regained his faith in God and in humanity, and he's redeemed. So the movie is terrifying, but to a large extent, it's kind of a projection of his internal struggle and his struggle with faith. Happy Death Day is another example, something a little more recent, which is a film I really liked, which now her getting stuck in the time loop is something that happens to her, and there's an external person trying to kill her. But the movie makes very clear that she's a really nasty person. She's a thought. she's manipulative, she's very materialistic, etc. And as she goes through the movie, she kind of comes to realize her faults and her flaws, and how she's treated other people and other people have treated her, etc. So by the end of the movie, she's become a completely different person, and it indirectly at least leads to her getting out of the cycle. And not only is she out of the cycle, but she can kind of move on with her life and be a better person than before. It's kind of, there's always a purgatory aspect to these. I think people misunderstand what purgatory is. Purgatory isn't limbo. You're not there forever. Purgatory is where imperfect people go to be purified, to kind of to get their sins taken out of them before they can proceed to heaven. And there's often an aspect of that within this. Then we have Split, which is also kind of an example of that, I'd say. So within Split, most of the girls all the girls except for the last girl get killed when they're kidnapped. And it's not exactly redemptive, I would say, but it's an example where the main character doesn't die, and they don't die because of something that they've undergone. Throughout the movie, we uncover more and more that the main girl had been abused. It made her a stronger person, etc. And at the end of the movie, it kind of comes full circle. The killer is in a position to take her down, but he sees that she's cut herself and tried to commit suicide. And he acknowledges her as someone who's suffered what he's suffered, who's been through hell and back, who's experienced her own harrowing. And he gives her an acknowledgement of respect and allows her to go. And she leaves a stronger person than when she enters. And I think part of what the ending is supposed to imply is that she finally has the strength to tell the police that she's being molested. So then the last exorcism is probably the most obvious example on this list. So Last Exorcism features a man who had made his career performing fake exorcisms. He has like all these specialized like equipment, like a cross that has a dry ice machine in it so it makes smoke. He has people like shake the room, etc. And he's going to go and perform one last exorcism and then reveal everything to the public. But it turns out that the girl is actually possessed. And the film ends with him choosing to go and face the demon. I think they summon the demon. It's like become this giant pillar of fire, and he raises the Bible and cross and walks at the demon, shouting prayers. He's regained his faith in God, and he's regained a purpose in his life. So even though he dies at the end, much as with The Exorcist, it is a redemption thing. It is ultimately a positive message. So then we have Retributive. So like I said, this is man is not meant to meddle. This is people's personal flaws bringing them down. So The Ring is on this list because if they hadn't have gone investigating, like it's very much an original sin thing. It's they're eating the apple when they put the tape into the machine. If no one had looked at the tape, if they had have just destroyed the tape and not looked at it, then it wouldn't have spread. And because people have to watch it, then whatever Samara comes and kills them, and then other people are curious about it, so they watch the tape, and then other people are curious about it, so they watch the tape, and it just kind of goes on and on and on. And it's one kind of sin after another that leads to the whole thing spreading and spreading and spreading. There's some things that men was not meant to see, but in that case, they went ahead with it. Event Horizon is similar. You have the hubris of basically trying to play God. Sam Neill's character becomes increasingly deranged throughout the movie, in part because of the demons from the Chaos Dimension or whatever, in part just his own hubris that he wants to be the one to crack the secrets of creation, to have the faster than light travel or whatever it is. Very often, this is a very common aspect in science fiction horror. Like I said, man trying to play God, Frankenstein creating a monster. A similar film to that is Ex Machina, where Oscar Isaac's character creates a functional robot, a functional android, who's apparently sentient. So it's in part his sin of making a machine in the likeness of a man, but it's also the sin of the main character who falls in love with the robot and the lets her out of the cage, and both the main character and Oscar Isaac are pay the ultimate price for their playing with things they don't understand and trusting things that they shouldn't trust. Finally, we have It Follows, which is kind of going back a bit to the more puritanical roots of slasher movies, where the demon is spread by sex, in particular by promiscuous premarital sex, because whenever somebody gets the STD or the sexually transmitted demon, they immediately go have sex with someone as quickly as possible, and then that person has sex with someone as quickly as possible, and that person takes the demon. So it's all about a series of people shirking off responsibility. Because if the first person had have just let the demon kill them, then the trail would have ended. But now it's like an endless stream of suffering that it causes in its wake, and it's all spread further and further by fornication and sexual immorality. And then the final type we have is cosmic horror. Now, like I said, cosmic horror is not necessarily Cthulhu. It, to my mind, is there's a natural phenomenon that's not dependent upon anything the main characters did or did not do. It's something external in nature. So It Comes at Night is, in my view, I think it's, even if they don't say it is, I feel like it's based off of Mask of the Red Death. It's about the inevitability of death. It's about, even if you hide for death, it'll eventually come for you. The real villain is the plague, and ultimately there's nothing that they can do to escape the plague. And all their paranoia, all their lack of trust ultimately just proves irrelevant in the face of death. A Quiet Place is a film in which the main characters are all good people. There's not really a redemptive element to it because John Krasinski's character doesn't need redemption, but he does die in place of one of the kids in it. But it is like it's nothing that the main couple did. It has nothing to do with them. It's just these monsters that showed up, etc. So it's cosmic horror in the sense that it's something completely unfair that they had no role in, and their suffering doesn't necessarily have a purpose. It's not to redeem them because they don't need redemption. It's not like a nihilistic or a negativistic movie, but it's something entirely external. Unsane is another example of this. This is kind of a non-supernatural example where you can watch my review about Unsane, but she's basically incarcerated as part of an insurance scheme. They get a psychiatrist to declare her crazy and incarcerate her in a mental hospital until her insurance runs out. And there's nothing she can really do to get out. Because whatever she does or doesn't do is interpreted as more evidence that she's crazy. So it's kind of this cosmic thing in the sense that nothing that's really happening is her fault. It's something external pushing in on her, but there's nothing that she can do about it. And then finally we have Halloween, or most slasher films, where Michael Myers is a force of nature. He's not really a human per se. He's just evil incarnate. And no matter how many times you kill him, no matter how many times you stop him, no matter how many times you knock him down, he's going to keep coming for you. And a lot of just kind of monsters that aren't created by man was not meant to meddle fit in this category. And yeah, so those are the different types of horror in my opinion. Like I said, it's an external versus internal, and moralistic versus, I guess you could say, amoralistic worldview. So I hope you enjoyed the video. Let me know what else you want to see, and I'll talk to you guys later.